So I picked up the Sony FX3 about 8 months ago, and it's been an absolute joy to work with this camera. When I first got it, it took a little while to learn all the ins and outs of it, but after like a month or so, I became super comfortable with it. The main thing I noticed about the Sony FX3 is how versatile and simple and minimal this camera is. It's really helped me refine in my workflow, making things smoother, quicker, and often easier. This camera is just so fun and easy to use. It gives you all the tools that you need, and you can create gorgeous looking images straight out of camera. So today I want to share with you guys the results of this entire process, the best settings that I found, the customization that I did, and the accessories that I use, and ultimately the entire workflow that I have with this camera, making filmmaking smoother and quicker and a lot easier. And of course, we're talking about the Sony FX3 today, and this is pretty much synonymous with the A7S3. It's basically the same camera. There's a couple key differences with the body design and the button layout. And if you don't own either of these cameras, just take these ideas, put it into your own camera system, dial in your workflow, and just figure out what changes you can make to make your workflow smoother. It's a constant process that everyone has to do with these camera systems. And ultimately, cameras are tools. They just allow us to be able to tell the stories we want to tell. And there's different workflows that are kind of favored towards each camera system. So anyway, starting off with my main settings for the Sony FX3. I shoot everything in PP8, SLOG3, sgamut3.cine, and I don't touch any of the settings. I just leave it as factory set, and I built my own Rec. 709 LUT based off of that. So SLOG3 gives you the most dynamic range possible. It has a gorgeous gamma curve, and it just creates really nice looking images. The highlight roll-off is beautiful, and it's just such an easy log profile to work with. So yeah, I love being able to get the most out of every camera, and shooting in the flattest log profile allows me to do so. Another popular picture profile that people enjoy is S-Cinetone. If you don't know what that is, I'll link a video down below for that. But S-Cinetone takes away some dynamic range, but you can get a great image straight out of camera with no grading. And then on top of that, I shoot everything in 4K 422 10-bit. Data rates will vary depending on the frame rate and resolution that you choose, but 4K 422 10-bit for everything. I shoot in 24 frames per second for like 95% of everything. Sometimes I'll shoot in 60, but 4K 24 is the gold standard for me. Never really been a fan of slow motion, and shooting everything in real time is just really nice. And then for codecs, I've kind of switched things up over time. So Sony gives you 3 codecs. It's basically S, SI, and HS. S is like the compressed codec where you save data, but it doesn't give you the best image quality, and it's also hard to edit. So I don't recommend shooting in that. At first, I started off shooting in SI, which is the like uncompressed all intra codec. It's super easy to edit. It gives you the highest image quality possible, but the data rates are freaking huge, and you can burn through SD cards like crazy. And then recently I've been starting to shoot in the H.265 codec, which is the HS. And this gives you the best of both worlds between S and SI. So you get small data rates, so you can save a lot of storage, but you also get high image quality. So it's still compressed. It's H.265, so it's a little bit harder to edit on some computers, but if you have one of the new M1 machines, you should have zero issues with the H.265 codec. This camera also shoots an external ProRes RAW through the HDMI port. I haven't felt the need to get an external recorder to record in ProRes RAW. The regular 422 10-bit codecs are more than enough for me. And to give an example of how much data you save, here's some recording times on a 256GB SD card in 4K 24, 100 megabytes per second. So in the SI, you get 2 hours and 18 minutes. In S, you get 5 hours and 22 minutes. In HS, you get 5 hours and 23 minutes. So it's pretty much double of what you get in SI, and I haven't had any distinguishable differences in image quality. I'd rather just have the save space on the SD cards for my own personal work and still have high image quality. So the HS just kind of makes sense nowadays. So I shoot everything in 4K 24, SLOG3, and the XAVC HS codec. And on top of that, I shoot everything in the base ISO. And it doesn't matter what camera you have, always shoot at the base ISO for whatever gamma curve you have. So for SLOG3, it's ISO 640 on the low end, and then ISO 12,800 on the top end. And having dual base ISO in a camera like that just makes it so flexible and so versatile. Shooting at ISO 640 is just really nice. It's super clean. It gives you the most dynamic range, the cleanest image. But when you bump it up to 12,800 ISO, it's still really clean, and it gives you the most dynamic range on that upper end. And I recommend only shooting at those two. Don't shoot at any in between. And oftentimes when you bump it up to 12,800, it's extremely sensitive, so you need to actually add ND to that and stop down a bit. So I just recommend just adding ND with 12,800, even if you're shooting in low light. A lot of the times it's way too bright because of how freaking good it is. And for white balance, I've kind of switched things up over time. At first I started off doing the auto white balance with the slow shockless white balance setting. So it's super slow and gradual as it changes. And then I had a toggle button on the back of the camera to basically lock the auto white balance. So when I'd start shooting, I'd let the camera read the scene, set the white balance, and then I would lock it. And then when the next scene changed or the lighting changed, I would unlock it and then let it reread again and then rinse and repeat. This was a little inconsistent because when you started zooming in and out, the white balance would start changing all over the place and it felt a little weird. So then I went to the presets like the daylight, shade, cloudy, fluorescent, and that seemed to work pretty well, but I believe those are only calibrated towards Sony lenses. So lately I've just been using classic old Kelvin, just changing the Kelvin depending on what scene I'm in. And when you're setting your white balance with Kelvin, you can kind of boof it sometimes, but thankfully with these 422 10-bit codecs, they're super flexible and there's a lot of latitude with them. So changing your temperature in post isn't too bad. It's definitely not like shooting in RAW, so you have to kind of like get it close enough, but there's definitely some leniency there if you want to change your white balance in post. And now for one of the most asked questions that I get, and arguably one of the most confusing things about this camera. And that question is, how do I expose SLOG3? At first, when I started out, I was exposing everything at plus 1.7 to plus 2, which is something that a lot of people tell you to do with these Sony sensors. And I was getting really washed out, just kind of crummy looking images that I didn't really enjoy. And I wasn't too happy with those results. So I wanted to make a change. So I went out and I would shoot multiple scenes at different exposures, bring it into post, and just see how each image reacted to the grading that I did and how it looks straight out of camera. And I ultimately came to a conclusion of shooting everything natural, just whatever looks good to my eye. I use the gamma display assist on the back of the screen so I can see the regular Rec 209 image. And if it looks good, I'm gonna roll with it. That simple process has helped me so much with exposing SLOG3, and now I feel extremely confident with it, knowing that I'm gonna get a consistent look out of SLOG3 every single time. So now for some camera settings. I shoot everything in movie mode, which is just like the standard old movie mode. I don't do the custom profiles to have like 4K 24 and 4K 60. If I need to change the frame rate, I'll just actually go and change the frame rate. I don't really do it that much, so just shooting a normal movie mode is nice. I don't have to guess what setting that I'm in, and I have all the settings all in one place. And that's super nice because when you're shooting run and gun, the last thing you need to worry about is being in the wrong mode. So everything stays in one. It's just pretty simple. But one of the most important things I learned over these months is the exposure control mode. So there's PASM, which is like your standard program, auto, scene, and manual. And then there's flexible exposure mode. And at first I started off using manual because I want to be able to control everything and have the camera not do anything automatically. But flexible exposure mode is interesting because it gives you 3 toggle buttons for your exposure triangle. So it gives you toggles for your shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And this is really nice because when I was using the manual mode and I was out shooting, I would bump the ISO dial and the shutter speed dial pretty frequently, which made my camera settings all over the place. And if you're shooting run and gun and you're not really paying attention to the camera settings, you'll be pretty bummed when you go back to your computer and see that your shutter speed was 1/3 and everything is all blurry and an absolute mess, or if your ISO was cranked to like 8,000 and it's a grainy, noisy mess. So I pretty much always have the shutter speed locked and the ISO locked. The ISO, I always use dual base ISO, so I'm either at 640 or 12,800. So that always stays locked until I go into low light. The aperture stays unlocked because I use the aperture all the time if I'm using a modern lens. And my shutter speed always stays locked as well. I always use the 180-degree shutter angle. Though this camera doesn't have it, I still take those same rules into it. So if I'm shooting at 24, I'll do 1/50. If I'm shooting 60, I'll do 1/125. And then if I want to get creative with having like fast shutter speed or slow shutter, I'll change those settings accordingly and do like the 90-degree shutter angle or the 270 or 360. It all just really depends. But for the most part, I leave shutter speed and ISO locked in. And having that flexible exposure mode is nice. Having those toggles because I set my settings and I don't have to worry about it changing when I'm out shooting. So I feel like that flexible exposure mode kind of makes up for not having shutter angle in this camera. So it could be kind of a hot take. And now for autofocus. Sony's autofocus is absolutely legendary. It's super reliable, it's snappy, it never misses, and the eye tracking is always there. The touch to track is a really nice feature to have, and I kind of use autofocus a lot of the times. I still use manual focus here and there for certain things, but when I use autofocus, I am never worried about it missing. So for the focus mode, I always use the zone autofocus. I like having the most control out of a camera possible, and having the zone focus allows me to direct the camera where to focus. On the FX3, you have a little thumb button, little joystick on top of the camera. So when you're holding it, your thumb naturally lays there. And with that, I'm able to move the zone focus around pretty quickly, allowing the camera to pick up focus wherever it needs to. The Sony FX3 also has a feature called touch to track. You can touch a subject and it'll track that subject until you basically turn it off. And I can see this feature being really good for product shots, or if you're tracking a fast moving subject like an athlete or if your subject's walking. I haven't used it too much. I definitely want to mess around with it more, but from the times that I have used it, it's never messed up. So that's definitely a cool feature to have in your toolkit, just making things a lot easier and simpler. And then in the same vein as focusing, for manual focus, I use peaking. Peaking is my favorite tool to make sure I get everything in focus when I'm using manual focus. For peaking, I leave it on either red or blue. I kind of cycle between the two because those are easy to see. And then I have the sensitivity on high. Because the screen is so small, having it on high sensitivity allows me to see more of what's in focus on the screen because it's so small. So peaking is a really great tool to use. I use it all the time with my manual lenses and my vintage lenses, and I highly recommend using it if you don't know what that is. Another legendary feature of the FX3 is the IBIS. The IBIS is phenomenal out of this camera. I've never really been a fan of IBIS, pretty much up until now, because IBIS in older cameras just wasn't really that good. There's no wobble to it. The standard is incredible. The active is even more insane. It kind of crops in a little bit by like 10% or something. It's not too bad. I definitely cycle between the two depending on how I feel. But when I have a bigger, heavier kit, I usually just use standard. But if I have a smaller kit, I'll use active because it kind of helps out having steadier handheld footage with a smaller kit. But if you're like me and you shoot handheld and tripod, make sure you turn IBIS off when you put it on a tripod. I've definitely messed up some footage by having IBIS on when I have it on a tripod because the camera is so steady and it has stuff moving in frame. It thinks the camera's moving, so it tries to compensate for that. So it usually ends up just drifting and kind of wobbling a bit. So make sure you turn it off when you use it on sticks. You definitely don't want to go back and be bummed that your footage was messed up. And on top of that, these cameras have gyro stabilization. So if you want to go the extra length and add another step in post, you could turn IBIS off on the camera, which kind of seems counterintuitive, but you put it into Catalyst Browse and then you do the gyro stabilization. So this camera reads the gyro data, however it moves, and then it'll stabilize it accordingly, which I think is a lot smoother than the normal stabilization in this camera, but I haven't felt the need to do gyro stabilization. One, it adds an extra step in post, which means more time. Two, the active and standard IBIS in this camera is actually really good, so I haven't really felt the need to get something more out of that. So I know a lot of people are jazzed up about that. I've never really thought about it. I don't have a need for it. I've been happy with the normal IBIS out of this camera. And now for audio. I have two main setups that I use for this camera. I have the MKE600, which I use for talking heads, anything where audio is important, or anything for client work. And then I have the Rode VideoMic NTG for having a smaller stripped down setup where I don't have the top handle. So with the MKE600, I always put it into input 1, and I have the 4-channel audio setup on the camera. And on input 1, I put it on phantom power and I put it on auto. And then on channel 2, I link it to channel 1 and then I put it on manual. So when I'm out filming, I could have a manual safety track in case the automatic is too high or too low. I always have a secondary track that I'm changing myself, and this has worked out really well. It's definitely saved my skin a bunch of times. So no matter what, I always recommend having a safety track with audio. But that's my main setup that I use for interviews, talking head, any client work. It's super simple. And then for my travel setup, I just use the Rode VideoMic NTG. It just plugs straight into the 3.5 port on the camera. And I keep the audio levels between 12 and 17 on camera. And then the mic has a gain dial on the back. So with that, I just change my audio kind of on the fly depending on the scene. And then one of the things I customize the most over time with this camera is the FN menu. And the FN menu is a function menu. There's a preset button on the back of the FX3 that allows you to pull up this menu. It's basically like a favorites menu or like a quick menu. I use this menu all the time. I keep all of my main important features in there so they're one click away, and I could change things quickly if I am out filming. So here are some of the features that I keep in the FN menu. I have peaking, so if I want to turn it off or on. Audio levels, it's mostly there for the Rode mic if I need to up the gain or decrease the gain. Zebras, I don't use zebras too much anymore, but I like having the zebra set at 94 plus, which allows me to see what's clipping on SLOG3. Recording frame rate, if I need to change from 24 to 60 or 120, I do that there. Media slot, sometimes when I'm filming different things at once, I try to record them to different cards. Oftentimes it becomes too cumbersome and kind of annoying, so I just record to one now and organize and post. Picture profile, I honestly don't know why I still have that there. I feel like I'm kind of paranoid that I'm gonna switch away from SLOG3, but I only use SLOG3, so that's always there. And then IBIS focal length, I have that there for when I shoot with my vintage lenses. Because these lenses and adapters don't have electronics, the camera can't read what focal length it's at, so I tell the camera what focal length I'm using if I'm using IBIS with that lens. And then I have metering. I use multimetering all the time, but sometimes I want to use spot metering, but for the most part I just use multimetering. And then I have focus modes. If I want to use spot focus, zone focus, or wide, I pretty much only use zone focus though. IBIS, I use this one all the time. it lets you change it from active to standard to turning it off. So when I go to and from a tripod, I always make sure it's turned off and then turned back on. And then display markers, I like to use these a lot for interviews. I like having the center marker and then the safe area, because I like having the safe area be around 90%. And then center marker is good because when I'm talking to the camera, I try to line up my nose to that. And the last one is Gamma Display Assist. For the most part, I have it turned on because it makes exposing a lot easier, but I've been trying to see what looks good with the Gamma display on and then turning it off and then learning that log image so I can get used to exposing just based off the log image. And now for some random camera settings. So lens compensation. This was something that I wish I knew about earlier, because when I had the Sigma 24-70, I was getting weird vignetting and distortion. So I did a ton of research. I ended up finding the setting and it was turned off for some reason. So I turned it back on and it basically treats it like the lens corrections in Adobe Lightroom. It takes away distortion and it takes away that vignetting and allows you to have a normal looking image. So for some reason that was turned off, it's turned back on now. So if you're having vignetting and distortion troubles, you should probably look into that. And the next one is release without lens. So when you're using vintage lenses, the camera doesn't think that there's a lens attached because there's no electronics there. This feature just overrides that and it tells the camera that it's okay to start going and there actually is a lens attached. So if you're adapting lenses and it's not working, that could be a feature that could be messing up for you. The next one is tally lights. I absolutely love that this camera has tally lights all over the place, but one of the main things that was kind of annoying was the emphasize recording display on the screen. So it'd give you like a little box that would surround the entire screen, and the LCD screen is already small enough, so having something that crops in a bit more that is over your image just kind of got annoying. And I can see the front. There's a tally light there, there's a tally light on the back, there's one on the record button. They're all over the place, so I like to turn that one off, and it allows me to see more of my image when I'm out exposing, primarily with this small screen. And then for the screen brightness, I kind of cycle between sunny weather and normal. Right now I'm using sunny weather because it's hard to see the screen with a light behind my camera, but I haven't really seen too much of a battery hit to it. It's really nice to use when you're out in the middle of the day shooting without having an external monitor. So being able to bump up the brightness on your screen is a really nice feature to have, but some of you guys who want the most battery life might want to turn that off. So yeah, the Sony FX3 has been a super versatile, fun, flexible camera for me to use that fits into pretty much everything that I throw at it. It works so well for YouTube, client work, stuff with Sam. We'll be using it for field trips soon. This camera is truly incredible, and I think Sony knocked it out of the park with this one. I love all the cinema features you have in this, the fan, the tally lights, the multiple record buttons. I often use the record button on the front left more so than the one on the top right. Most of the times when I'm out shooting with this camera, I'm using the top handle, and when you're holding it, it's kind of hard to reach and get the record button on the top. There's usually a mic or a monitor in the way. So having an extra record button on the front left is just a really nice feature to have. It just makes things a lot smoother. One of the main things I love about this camera is the video focus layout. You have a button for white balance, peaking, zebras, display, shutter speed, ISO, aperture. There's so many different things on there that are all video focused that I would have to customize to make it a preset for that anyways on a different camera. So having it all in one, built in, straight out of the factory is a really nice thing to have. But one of the main buttons I've been really enjoying lately is the focus magnification. I've never used this before. I've never really had a camera that's had it, but it's a really nice feature to have. When I'm shooting with my contact size lenses, I'm able to press that button, zoom in, see if my subject is in focus, dial it in because the screen's so small, and then I can just press it again, it zooms out, and I'm good to go. So I use it all the time for tripod shots, if I'm using manual focus. I don't really use it all the time with autofocus because I could see the box and I know it's in focus, but having that focus magnification close by is something that I didn't even think I would really enjoy, but I use it all the time. Okay, so now that's all the setting talk. Let's get into some gear, and all these accessories we'll be talking about will be linked in the description below if you want to check those out. So with the Sony FX3, I pair it with my Sigma 24-70. It's an incredible lens. I use it all the time. I actually just released my review on this lens probably last week, so I'll link that down in the description below too. But alongside of that, I also have a small kit of contact size vintage primes. I have a 28, 50, and 85. I feel like these vintage primes pair so well with this camera because this camera is tiny anyways. Those lenses are extremely small, and having this small, powerful kit in the palm of your hands just feels like you're cheating. The full frame sensor paired with these full frame lenses just looks absolutely gorgeous. So that's actually one of my favorite setups to use for client work and even personal work. And alongside of that, I use the ProGrade V90 256GB SD cards. I have two of those. I've never once filled them up. I've gotten close to maybe like 130. So you could get away with the 128s. For me, I really enjoy having the extra headroom that I have with these 256GB cards. And the V90s are complete overkill. I don't shoot in 120 pretty much ever, but it's nice being able to have that in case there's a certain project where I need to shoot at higher frame rates. And then to protect those SD cards, I have a Pelican SD card case. Whenever I'm done shooting, I always put the cards in the case, put the case in my pocket, because sometimes cameras can mess up and sometimes wipe your footage. I've heard that on Blackmagic cameras. I don't know if this camera would do that, but I'm always just scared because that footage is super valuable and the last thing you need is for it to get completely wiped on the day of the shoot. So having that Pelican SD card case is a small, just good feature to have for extra security. Another accessory I've enjoyed is the Tilta full cage. This full cage gives you a little hand strap on the side, so it makes hand holding this camera pretty easy. And it also gives you an archetype Swiss plate built into the cage on the bottom. So if you're using any archetype ball head, you'll need to add an additional plate to it. It just slides right into the ball head and you're good to go. Personally, I haven't been using the cage for the last month or so. I've just been trying to go back to the minimal mindset of this camera. I've actually put the Peak Design anchors on it, so I use the Peak Design slide strap. It just kind of gets me back to that old mindset of shooting with the A6500, where I had this really powerful camera, just really small, slung over my neck, and it was just really easy to carry around everywhere. It makes it a little bit lighter, so if you want to add more weight to the camera, I'd probably just throw the cage on it anyways, but for me, it's just been really nice having no cage and having those anchors on there. And I've also paired it up with the Peak Design capture clip, so I put the little archetype plate at the bottom, and then I have the Peak Design clip on my backpacking bag, my camera bag, so when I'm out walking around, I just slide it in, lock it, and it's good to go. It's truly incredible having this powerful of a camera in that small of a form factor that I can just clip it to my camera strap. And because the Sony FX3 is so small while being so powerful, it's gonna make it so easy to bring it out into the backcountry, and I'm absolutely psyched to do that. Another accessory I have for that is the Siri ST124 carbon fiber travel tripod. It's really nice having a smaller kit that I can use a smaller tripod. It's so easy to take anywhere, and I can put it in a duffel, fly with it, and I have my main tripod with me at all times. So it's been pretty nice having that archetype plate to go between the capture clip and the tripod. It's just been a really nice system that's been super fluid and versatile for me. One of the main accessories I've been enjoying is the Condor Blue handle extension. The stock handle out of the FX3 is a little small, so when you're holding it, your hand doesn't really fit on it entirely, so this handle extension is nice. It gives you an extra inch or so, and it just feels way more comfortable to hold this camera. For me, I always want to use this top handle because of the XLRs. I don't want to use any third-party handle, so having that handle extension really amplifies the usability of this top handle from Sony. Another accessory I've been enjoying is the Cable Techniques low-profile XLR cables. At first, I was using a foot-long cable with my MKE600 when it was in the mic mount, and I'd have to wrap the cable around the handle, which just got kind of annoying and a little in the way. So I found these cables. They're 6 inches long. They sound amazing. I've never had issues with audio quality, and they don't get in the way at all. But it's kind of on the expensive side, but I think it's worth it, especially with this camera. Keeping cables out of the way is super important. It looks clean, but it's also super functional. And the battery life out of this camera is actually really good. I only own 3 Sony batteries, and I also have 2 Sony chargers. I always recommend using the brand's batteries and also their chargers. You want to make sure your battery life stays high. You don't want to have anything degrade over time. 3 batteries has been more than enough for me. I usually use 1 or 2 per day, but if I have a bigger shoot, I'll bring my 2 Sony chargers and I'll cycle those batteries on and off the chargers throughout the day. So a 4th could be nice, but for the most part, carrying 3 around has been pretty easy, and it's been really nice not having to have a big full rig with a giant V-mount battery. They're pretty affordable and they're really light, so they don't get in the way at all. And now for one of the bigger issues that people have with this camera, the lack of internal ND. And I don't really mind it too much. I've been on this whole journey to find the best ND filters, and I finally found them. I'll link that video below if you want to check out the whole journey behind that. But these Nisi IR ND filters are close to perfect. They have no color shift, no vignetting, and it looks pretty identical to internal ND. You just need a 3 and a 6 stop, carry it around in a little fanny pack. It takes no time to swap them out. So personally, I don't really care that this camera doesn't have internal ND. It keeps the size small, it keeps the cost low. Get yourself some high quality filters. You don't need internal ND in this camera. This camera is phenomenal. It's not really a pain point with it, and it's not really that big of a deal. So now let's talk about how I use the Sony FX3. The majority of the time I find myself shooting handheld. A couple times I'll shoot on a tripod, and I've never thrown it on a gimbal. With this camera being so small, it can definitely be a little worrisome to introduce micro jitters when you're shooting handheld. Just add on some weight. Adding on a heavier lens or an external monitor, or even the top handle with a mic, can definitely help smoothen out your handheld footage. But when you're shooting with it stripped down, it can definitely get a little too light. But if you go out and practice shooting handheld, you'll definitely be able to get better handheld footage out of this camera. So with this camera, I find myself building it into 3 different types of rigs. I have my minimal rig, I have my client rig, and I have my hybrid. So my minimal rig is like my travel, YouTube, run and gun rig. I basically have it fully stripped down, so there's no top handle. I just have whatever lens I want to shoot with, and then I have my Rode VideoMic NTG on top. And then I usually rock that with the capture clip or the Peak Design camera strap. For most of the times when I'm shooting for YouTube, I keep everything in that minimal kit because it's nice having that small of a kit. And then for my client rig, I have it built out with a top handle with my MKE600, as well as a friction arm and my Small HD 702 Touch. Having this full rig with a high quality mic and a big 7-inch screen just makes filming a lot easier. I can pull focus and frame things up a lot easier, and the client can even check out the footage if they want to on the big 7-inch monitor. This rig works out really well for the client shoots that are super important. And then for the rig that I found myself using probably 70% of the time, it's the hybrid rig. So it's basically the client rig without the big 7-inch monitor. So it's just the camera, the lens, the top panel, and the mic. And it's honestly been really nice learning to love that LCD screen on the back. It's a little smaller, it's not as nice as using a 5-inch or 7-inch monitor, but it gets the job done. And having this kit without the big 7-inch monitor and having cables all over the place and extra batteries to worry about, it's just something nice because it gets a little fragile and scary when you have all these things sticking out of the camera. And when you're getting in and out of the car, going from spot to spot, it gets a little cumbersome because the camera's a little fragile now with having these cables and monitors everywhere. So every time I go out and shoot with Sam, I just use this hybrid setup because it's super quick, it's small, and it gets the job done. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. All these things came from trial and error over these last 8 months, and it's been really fun to learn all the ins and outs of this camera. The Sony FX3 is truly an incredible camera. It's extremely versatile, it's minimal, it's simple, and it makes filmmaking so much easier and often way more fun. I absolutely love this camera. It's easily the best camera I've ever used, and it's been fun to really dial in my workflow and figure out the best settings that I like, the customization that really makes sense for me, and also the accessories that make filmmaking easier. So it's been a fun process with this camera, and I know it's a bit pricey, but I think it's a solid investment for literally any filmmaker. I think a lot of people can benefit from owning this camera. It just makes the workflow so much easier and so simple and so fast. But again, if you don't know the foundations of filmmaking, if you don't know those basics, you're gonna have a tough time getting the most out of this camera, or any camera for that matter. So spend the time on YouTube, go out and practice, try different techniques, learn your camera in and out, and when it's time to upgrade, go through that process again of learning the camera in and out. These are ultimately tools. Don't go buying camera system after camera system. There's no bad camera on the market. Just find one that makes sense for you with the features that you like in your price range. So yeah, if you guys have any questions or comments about the workflow, the accessories that I use, or the settings that I found, leave a comment down below. I'd also love to hear the kind of workflow you guys have found with your cameras and the settings you found, especially if you own an FX3 or an A7S3. I'm always down to check out other people's styles and workflows because I can learn a lot from that, because there's certain things that stick out to you that don't stick out to me. So with all that, take it easy, guys. See you next week. Peace.